Hi, Nathan and Tom. We're
Oh, hello.
joined ahead of Noirwich and the launch of the Sainsbury Centre's Can We Stop Killing Each Other season. Thanks for joining me to talk about crime literature. And your
Pleasure. Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Please, can you introduce yourselves and Noirwich itself?
Sure. My name's Tom Benn. I'm an associate professor of crime writing at UEA part-time, but I'm mainly a novelist. So I'm a short story writer, creative nonfiction, screenplays. I do a little bit of everything, and I kind of claim it all as crime writing, even when my publishers claim otherwise. And I was the co-founder, and I'm currently the co-director of the UEA MA in Crime Fiction, which is celebrating its 10th year as of this September. And I co-direct it with my esteemed colleague, this crime thriller extraordinaire, Dr. Nathan Ashman.
Yes, so I'm Nathan. I teach across literature and creative writing. As Tom said, I'm the co-director of the MA in Crime Fiction, whereas Tom is a novelist. I'm on the more kind of literary critical side of things. And yeah, this year is our 10th year anniversary of the MA in Crime Fiction, and we're celebrating that this year with the Noirwich Crime Writing Festival, which is a festival we run every year, themed around crime, unsurprisingly. So this year we're having a kind of bumper event. We've got Lee Child, we've got Oyinkan Braithwaite to kind of mark this landmark in our course. So the idea of the festival has always been to celebrate crime fiction in its kind of creative and critical capacities, to think backwards about where the genre's been, but also to think forwards about where it's going in the future.
We are talking ahead of Sainsbury Centre's Can We Stop Killing Each Other season.
Mm-hmm.
There's 5 interlocking exhibitions as part of that, one of which is Eyewitness, which asks people across the world why people across the world are so fascinated with the dramatisation of killing. So it looks at theatre, it looks at puppetry, it looks at literature and painting that's come out of literature, Shakespearean tragedies, the list goes on. Why do you think it is that people turn to crime novels for pleasure, I guess, when we're getting increasingly sort of scared to turn the news on and the world is quite a tough place to listen to what's going on in it?
I think, for one, we've always been interested in transgression, why we do what we do to each other. So it's not necessarily new, but living in an algorithm-driven world where we're constantly bombarded with garden variety and state-sponsored atrocities on our algorithms, on our feeds, it's harder to kind of, the separation between our daily lives and all these kind of horrors and injustices is harder to kind of close off. And I think whenever the world is particularly uncertain or unstable, there is a kind of a very human need to kind of see the kind of complexity and our moral complicity in that reduced into something simpler, something that gives us conclusive answers and closure. And these things are cyclical. As my colleague Nathan can attest to in terms of the golden age of crime writing, typified by Agatha Christie's and the Dorothy L. Sayers. That emerged as a very, very popular commercial wave in the aftermath of the kind of blood and horror of World War I, where people wanted an escape from that bloodshed. When we lost entire generations of men to war, we were retreat. Murder became a kind of a bloodless parlor game, where it was a kind of an intellectual puzzle that was kind of safe and comforting. You want the comfort blanket rather than the edgy leather jacket.
Yeah.
And so, similar to the early 20th century, we've got hyperinflation almost. We've got the rise of ethno-nationalism and fascism across Europe. Just like in the 1920s and 1930s, gender and racial and class hierarchies are much more kind of unstable, much more fluid now, and that produces certain anxieties that we want to kind of, some people want to confront, but other people want to escape from into slightly more nostalgic, slightly more reactionary at times fantasies. And so we seek that comfort, and I think it's a very human thing as well. It's not necessarily a pejorative. Yeah. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think that it's interesting actually, because this is always the question that I pose my students in the opening seminar to my crime fiction module undergraduate, and also the crime fiction module I teach at postgraduate is, why do we read crime fiction? What is it that attracts us to something that is quite nasty at its heart? But I think what's always interesting is to see, the commercial market sometimes gives a good indication of why people are reading things at a certain time. So Tom mentioned at the moment, I think what's been really interesting in the last kind of 4 or 5 years, particularly post-COVID, is how much people are kind of going to cozies and those old classic whodunits that take place in a very enclosed environment. And I think because there's something comforting in that, as Tom said, the Golden Age novel emerges after the First World War, and in a moment where you get modernism, where novelists are fragmenting literary style to reflect the kind of rubble of the modern world. Crime writers are creating these Edwardian fantasies where you have these baronial homes with aristocrats shipping champagne, even though that world's kind of already gone. But there's something in the reading of that reassures us that world still exists. So it becomes a kind of nostalgia. So I think often you might seem why we reading crime fiction is so ghastly when the world is so ghastly. But I think sometimes, depending on what kind of form that is, it can offer something different. And I think at the moment, because things are not their best, I think there's a tendency to go towards the form of the genre that is actually comforting in some way, reinforces certain national myths, certain ideas about what it means to about national identity or about class distinctions, things that we hold kind of true to our sense of self or true to our sense of the world. These novels offer kind of reassurances and comfort to those kinds of things. So it depends what kind of subgenre of the genre you're reading and for what reason. But I think the explosion of the Golden Age tells us something about what readers are looking for in those novels at the moment.
Another kind of vessel to kind of process and interrogate our collective fears and fantasy through genre fiction was the emergence of noir and hardboiled fiction in the 1930s and 40s through to the 50s. Right. And those kind of anxieties that are kind of retreated from around gender and class in hardboiled and noir fiction, they're much more explicit. These kind of ideas of kind of women entering the workplace and kind of taking what has been historically male positions, kind of, emerges in this idea of the femme fatale archetype, the woman who can devour the male, do everything better, and triumph ultimately.
Well, I think it's Megan Abbott that argues that noir, which in its first iteration is kind of in the post-war period, where it's responding to the anxieties of gender relations, as Tom explained, after the war. And then we get kind of another emergence of it in the 70s and the kind of wake of Vietnam and Watergate and these kinds of things. And then we've had it more recently with domestic noir, which I think has been a response to kind of gender violence, but also the kind of lack of recourse for women who have been victims of domestic abuse, the kind of failures of the state to provide for those people. So she sees noir as almost a kind of a way that our culture expresses its dissatisfaction that emerges at points when we feel particularly dissatisfied. Okay. So it almost becomes a kind of outlet, a kind of volcanic eruption of those dissatisfied.
Yeah, with a form of kind of institutional cynicism as well.
Yeah,
there's nothing
everything's
about Agatha Christie because everybody knows their place.
Yeah,
everything is ultimately restored. The class order is restored. The gender order is restored. The racial dynamics are always restored. Everybody knows their place. And if those who don't are swiftly punished, crime and the moral book stops with the individual. While in noir, the kind of twin shadow, it's systemic. Crime is a problem of the community. It's a problem of the institutions. It doesn't stop with the individual. And so you can't offer that easy comfort and closure that once this victim has achieved justice, in whatever form that is, cosmic, moral, judicial, legal, you can close the book and go to sleep and the world's fine. Order has been restored. And noir, says that that's not possible.
We're seeing a development of more extreme or harsh, gory storylines in them, such as Harlan Coben's novels, which have been adapted into Netflix dramas because they are more extreme. And when you turn on Midsummer Murders or an old Agatha Christie now, you think how tame that is and how, sort of obvious the storyline is, or it seems more fictional in a way. But the modern writers are more real. They seem like real people's lives. What does that say about us as a society, that that's what is being created now, that is wanted?
Personally, do you agree with that?
Well, I was about to say, I think in a sense, I think it returns to that question about why do we read crime fiction? And some people read crime fiction, I think, to get some kind of vicarious pleasure through touching something dark and terrible. And sometimes that's through really extreme expressions of violence. And actually, I think crime fiction has always had its more, pornographic side to it, where you can get these if you look at the 70s, the kind of late 20th century, you get writers like Derek Raymond, for instance, who's writing these kind of super violent novels. I mean, even in the kind of forensic novels of the 90s, those kinds of
Patricia Cornwell,
those kinds of things. They tend to be super, super violent. And it's a kind of part of the genre that some readers will be drawn to and some won't. And I think those who are drawn to that, I think it is that. So I guess what I'm saying to start with is I think that violence has always been there in the genre, that really, really super violent version of the genre, particularly in the 20th century, once we get past the kind of golden age with hard-boiled and everything from that point. And I think for readers who are interested in that, I think there is something about touching those kind of darkest capacities that we all perhaps fantasize about having or fantasize about not having, that enables us to kind of touch it vicariously but not actually be contacted by it directly. So that would be my kind of response to why I think these violence storylines or these really kind of extreme expressions of violence are appealing to some people, because it speaks to the things we fear most and then allows us to come in contact with them in some way without being hurt by them, I think.
I think before I get into the why, it's worth kind of interrogating the premise a little bit, because I mean, there were readers and writers and critics who were contemporary to Agatha Christie who were ridiculing her for being tame and morally disingenuous for her treatment of the violent extinguishing of human life. You know, Raymond Chandler in his Simple Art of Murder says, you know, she's reduced murder to a parlor game. You know, these people, you know, this is, that it has a kind of artificiality which is kind of morally insensitive in some ways. And at the same time, you know, there was a kind of the mid-20th century, in certainly Anglo publishing, you know, my expertise is beyond that is limited. But there was a kind of Wild West in the pulps where we have enormously transgressive and xenophobic and racist and misogynistic and graphically violent crime fiction from about the late 1950s up until the early 1980s. And as it kind of tells the story of the history of publishing, and as all these kind of pulpy, janky imprints get consolidated by these kind of mega transnational corporations, the genre itself becomes more corporatized and gentrified. And the troubling id that addresses through science fiction and horror and crime fiction and fantasy fiction kind of gets softened. There's some incredible experimental, violent, transgressive writing that just would not get published today.
Yeah,
that would have been, you know, you would have found that in copies in Woolworths in 1975. And I think that's very interesting. So in many ways, the genre has become more sanitized, more gentrified. It's more middle-brow rather than low-brow than it was.
I think it's on the edges are kind of less sharp.
The edges are less sharp is a really pithy way of putting it. But at the same time, I know what you mean. You're not getting F-bombs in your average Agatha Christie novel, and you're not getting 12-page descriptions of the violations on a usually a female body in those novels. But very quickly in the 20th century, you do start to get those things. And I think that an editor at a major publishing house of crime fiction would question that thematically. Is this aesthetically justified? You know, it's not every depiction is an endorsement in art. You know, and it goes for all artistic mediums, not just narrative ones and page-bound mediums. But this question of why, like, what is the intention behind this? What is it in service of? Is a question. But in terms of like why we do this, I mean, it's interesting that the majority of crime readers and crime consumers, podcast, fiction, true crime media are women. You know, and there's been lots of. I'm not a sociologist. There's lots of kind of cultural studies and sociological studies to kind of, you know, question why this might be. Psychoanalytical studies as well. You know, and you know, a lot of answers tend to fall on this idea that there's a form of collective catharsis, that there's almost a pressure valve for the violent injustices of patriarchy, that you can kind of bear witness to these horrors. A slightly more reactionary reading,
kind of rending them inert by seeing them on the page.
Exactly. A slightly more reactionary reading might be that they kind of fulfill the function that fairy tales used to. This idea of Little Red Riding Hood, you know, warning the little girl not to stray from the path. Listen to your elders, your grandmother, and your mother's instruction. You know, not wear clothing that will
really interesting
that will attract the predatory male, the wolf that you might meet on your journey throughout life, through the cusp of sexual maturity and beyond into adulthood. And this idea that women see how to avoid the predator. You're engaging with that podcast and through, you know, kind of heightened reality of crime fiction. This is what happened to this victim. I don't want to be a victim. And obviously, you know, that's false, really, because, you know, these are extreme, you know, narratives. You know, these are transgressions. Not to say that, you know, violent misogyny and these murders and killings aren't happening, but they're narrativized, they're constructed, whether that's in a crime novel or in a true crime podcast. And you're not going to find the tools to protect yourself against the predator within them. But there is a need there might be a kind of fundamental kind of psychic need to look for them in the way that once we looked for that kind of tutelage and instruction and moral education from the fairy tale, from the campfire story. And I think the crime genre does occupy that space in a modern sense in some ways, for better and for worse.
And it's, bringing that into a sort of adult domain, because fairy tales are traditionally for children, and it's bringing that, that's an interesting comparison. And how has this changed, particularly in recent years with COVID and us sort of reaching for something to get away from our living rooms and escape our houses? And I think a lot of people, didn't they, turn to crime novels in COVID for that page turning aspect.
Yeah, and I think some of the reasons for that, I think we've covered with the point about the reassurance or comfort that a certain kind of fiction presents or provides to its readers. But I think in general, there's something, I think the thing to consider about crime fiction as well is that it is fiction. I mean, often it's a mistake to equate the crimes we see in these novels with real life crimes. Often they're completely heightened or completely dramatized versions of what real crime is actually like. So what I think crime fiction often does, and one of its kind of key underlying kind of motives since it first emerged, is I think there is a kind of ideological function to crime fiction, i.e. it's there to kind of reassure us that everything is not only going to be okay, but that there's a kind of causal chain behind why things happen. So, if there's a mystery, we always find out that it happened in this way. There's always we start with a mystery and we find out the kind of causal relations that led to that crime. And it suggests that there's a kind of pattern and reason behind why everything happens. But I think reality is a lot messier than that. There isn't always a clear reason why something happens. There isn't always a clear explanation for why things happen. But crime fiction kind of makes us believe that there is, and makes us believe that the state is looking after us, that it has our best interests in mind. And even when I think a novel is a kind of radical novel that's very against the state, I think the crime novel still in some ways fulfilling, unless it's actually trying not to, that kind of that reassuring function.
Just by virtue of narrativizing the crime, the criminal, the victim, the detective/investigator, in some form or other, these novels operate on those those tropes and tenets and architecture. That's why it's a genre. It has these kind of familiar apparatus.
Yeah, because fundamentally, I think it's about policing. There's this kind of, D.A. Miller argues about the relationship between the novel and the police, that the novel becomes a kind of extension of the police, not just in novels about the police, but general as a kind of a way to police us through the material and stuff that we receive from a novel. And I think crime fiction, it can have a very kind of radical view, anti-view of the state, or a very conservative reactionary view. But I think in some ways it's always about the way that we exist within a society. And largely, that's how we arrange societies, I think.
Because there can't be transgression without laws to transgress, and morals and communities and values, laws to uphold them, and carceral justice for people. We're told to advocate if somebody wrongs you, the state will punish them on your behalf, so you don't have to take the law into your own hands. And all of these things kind of play out. I think it's what's interesting in terms of how this has changed recently, and kind of feeding into your point about the kind of ideological function of popular fiction and popular genre fiction, is where if it is a kind of state propaganda for the police, where you've got your Rebus novel on the police detective, and he's always going to catch the killer and do his best, and he might be a flawed hero, an alcoholic with marital trouble, but he's an honourable man, a light bringer seeking justice. When you get things like the Black Lives Matter movement and the killing of George Floyd, and suddenly you've got these kind of wave of protests and this kind of suddenly this institutional distrust in this huge facet of the state, the police, the judicial system, and then you have this kind of arm of media and entertainment who are kind of either explicitly or tacitly functioning as propaganda for that. Suddenly, what do you do about that? Do you suddenly acknowledge that? Is it business as usual? What does the crime writer do? What does the crime reader think? Suddenly, they're kind of questioning kind of comforting fantasy of this, that the police are always there for you and they're always going to protect you and they're always going to get you justice in some form or other. And suddenly it's harder to believe in that comforting fantasy. And do you want the crime genre, I think, is elastic enough to kind of interrogate that for those readers and writers and critics.
Because noir is very kind of often makes you feel very discomforted about the state of the. It's not reassuring. I suppose. I think a lot of readers go to crime novels though because what's interesting I think is, I would suggest that crime novels where most people, if they read a crime novel that wasn't an answer to the kind of mystery that was presented, would feel very dissatisfied with that as a reading experience. Yeah. Even though that's personally, there's a whole kind of subset of crime novels that deliberately do that to frustrate
like an answer.
The impulse. But if you have a mystery, you get through the end, you're like, so I'm not going to find out who did it.
All that, and
you feel
no
cheated
answer,
because it's hard baked into it that it's going to answer the questions and that things can be explained. And I think there's something in that idea that there's a pattern and reason behind everything that we find very, very reassuring, even if the novel itself is full of violence, full of murder, full of all of these kind of horrific things. If at the end it still reassures us that everything's going to be put back in the box, then we come out of it going, feeling in some way reassured by that. So I think people aren't really reading those for the murders, for the kind of brutal crimes. I think they're reading them for the characters. They're reading them for the kind of levity of the prose and of the characters that are in there. So I think that's an interesting thing that's happening. You're right that's if horror does seem to be expressing our anxieties and fears in a much more visceral, literal sense than crime does at the moment. But perhaps you go to different things for different reasons.
We ask big questions at the Sainsbury Centre. So we've said how this is in advance of Can We Stop Killing Each Other, our season coming up. We're coming to the end of Can the Seas Survive Us? We've had What is Truth? Why Do We Take Drugs? And you've touched on why it's important in literature to do these things and answer these questions people have. And the same in art. We're not here to answer the questions, but what would be a big question each of you would like to see the Sainsbury Centre ask?
Yeah. I think something around, I think something we were discussing today actually, about what for me, the most pressing question or the most pressing revolution we're going through at the moment, in the same way as perhaps the printing press changed everything when it emerged, is the emergence of AI. And I think what the future looks like with AI, if that's not too a kind of vague question, and particularly what that means, not only for us as a society, but also for our kind of creative industries and the things that we're interested in, and particularly the way we think and write about crime. I think that's something for me, is kind of one of the most pressing questions of where we are.
Agreed, yeah. Like, who will the future belong to? Who or what will the future belong to?
That's perhaps a better way of putting it.
Because it may not be us.
No.
And maybe that's okay. And maybe that's all right.
Maybe,
yeah.
That's it. We had a good run, didn't we?
Yeah.
As a species, yeah.
I think that's it, isn't it? The end of the world, the end of our world doesn't mean the end of the world. And I think sometimes that distinction.
You're not the first person that we've chatted to about this that said that we're not the only creatures allowed to live on this planet, sort of thing. But for the near future, sort of thinking about that in a regard of what do you teach your students, what do you teach the next generation of writers, where we're already seeing books on Amazon that are AI written and people don't know they're out there. I was listening to a podcast recently where the person on it had discovered that there was an autobiography of them on Amazon. William Hanson. And they were having a laugh about it, but equally like, don't buy this book, it's AI, which is terrifying, but that's already happening without people knowing in the background.
Yes.
It's massive, disruptive, destabilizing technology, and we've no idea where it's going to be in the next 2 years. So,
And it's the speed of development is what's so scary, how quickly each iteration of whatever platform it is improves upon the last, and how quickly that improvement is happening. I think it's completely impossible for us to conceive of how big a transformation it's going to be. That, and obviously climate change, and crime fiction has been responding in recent years to a subject like that through novelists that have been writing crime novels that have a kind of ecological crime at the centre. But AI it seems as big as that to me as a question about the future and where we're going to be.
Kind of, what do we owe the past? What do we owe our past as well? in terms of I mean, as a novelist, I'm not someone who's kind of comfortable kind of writing about the contemporary. In order to kind of figure out how we got here, I have to kind of look to the past. And then we have a kind of, or do we, do we have a moral duty or moral responsibility to the past, whether, that's a question a novelist or an artist has when we're kind of representing people or events that actually happened, and we're going to narrativize and fictionalize those to some degree, and bend them to kind of speak to certain values and ideologies, whether kind of explicitly or ambiently. And this idea of like, what do we owe our past? This idea, and like how, because our past is everything. It's that tension between the kind of the Faulkner quote, isn't it? The past isn't even the past. It's always, we're living it right now. The past is never dead. But this also, kind of conversely, this idea of the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. And that tension between the two is interesting, and it's constantly being fought in the present. Yeah. And the past is what determines the present, but it also determines the future. And these kind of lost futures that are constantly foreclosed from us, that we can no longer access because of the myths we tell each other and ourselves about the past. So these things are constantly snakes eating their own tails. They're constantly tying themselves in knots. So something about this idea of what we owe our past. The question is, who is we and whose past? Because the past isn't a linear giant thing. It's all these kind of networks and webs and footnotes that are constantly being kind of scrubbed out and erased. But we're constantly narrativizing our past to tell each other in order to tell stories for the present and stories into the future. So that's it. Yeah. So that would be my big question. What do we owe the past?
Right. Interesting you should say that in front of Anton Ford's work. There's a smaller Poe in the middle, which is representing the future generation, and the Maori object at the front is representing past ancestors. And it's a conversation between past, present, and future, and how the present can learn from both things and talk to the future in the way that it should be, advised to continue.
We're all on a continuum, right? Like it's all one wiggly line.
And might not be linear, who knows? I won't go into that. Thank you very much. Fascinating to hear all of your wisdom on this topic, and really looking forward to Norwich and seeing where the MA takes you.
So are we.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us. Appreciate it.
Cheers.